The file was 31 years old, and nobody had read all of it. It sat in the Dominion's Central Archive, a vast, cold place where 700 years of expansion records lived in long crystalline stacks, stamped low priority, monitor only, and labeled with the standard designation given to species that weren't yet worth worrying about. The species in question called themselves humans. The Dominion survey team had found them the way you find an anthill near a road, noticed them, cataloged them, moved on. The initial report was 12 pages. Most of it was biology. The biology was unimpressive soft bodies with no natural armor, limited sensory range, a lifespan that barely cleared a century if nothing went wrong first. Their technology was behind the galactic average by roughly 300 years. They had managed to put a few stations in orbit around their home planet and were making early noise about their nearest moon. Their home world had a single large ocean they called different names depending on which part of it you were looking at, as if one body of water needed 7 different identities. This detail made it into the report under the heading * Cultural Irrationality Indicators *. Class 3 Emerging Species, the file said, pre-warp, tribalistic, biologically fragile. Then, at the bottom of the first page, in the section marked Additional Observations, someone had written, displaying characteristic threat inflation behaviors consistent with prey species social hierarchies. In the margin beside that line, handwritten, in an alphabet the archivists flagged as unidentified, were 2 small words. Nobody read them. The file was closed. The humans were added to the monitoring list and forgotten about in the way that things get forgotten when nobody expects them to matter. 31 years later, Ambassador General Yeva Solano stood at the central disclosure podium of the Galactic Interspecies Seat and told the assembled powers of the known galaxy exactly what Earth wanted them to know. Not everything. What she wanted them to know. The seat was built for large purposes, and the room knew it. The ceiling curved up in a shape designed to make everyone inside feel equally small, a diplomatic trick as old as architecture, one that had stopped working on Yeva somewhere around year 7. Representatives from 43 species sat in their sections, in chairs and cradles and liquid tanks and suspension filaments, depending on what their bodies required. The light came from everywhere at once and cast no shadows, which Yeva had always found unsettling in a way she couldn't fully name. The air was recalibrated every 8 minutes to meet the competing atmospheric needs of the room, and the result was something that didn't smell like anything, which was worse than smelling like something bad. She was 54 years old. She had been doing this specific job for 12 years and before that had spent 19 years doing related work in smaller rooms with smaller stakes. She had the kind of face that didn't give things away, not trained blankness, just the natural result of having kept score for a very long time in a game where showing your hand cost lives. Her hair had gone gray at 40 and she'd let it, because she had more pressing decisions to make. She read from the document. Earth's military capability, as disclosed, 38 registered warship classes, active fleet numbers by category, defensive installation data for all flagged systems, weapons systems listed by range, yield, and delivery mechanism, all of it formatted to the Galactic Seat's standard disclosure template, all of it technically accurate, all of it filed under Earth's voluntary compliance with the interspecies transparency, accords that every species signed and nobody followed fully, which was simply the understood nature of the accords. The high chorus Vel'Thas of the Dominion seat processed the disclosure with its 11 minds running in smooth consensus. Bioluminescent patterns moved beneath the surface of its body, pale greens and cool blues shifting in slow, deliberate waves. This was the Velshara equivalent of a calm, closed expression. The Dominion had absorbed 9 species in the past 2 centuries. It knew what an emerging military looked like. It knew what middle-tier capability sounded like when it was being read aloud. This sounded like that. A known quantity doing its paperwork. Yeva watched Vel'Thuz process the numbers. She watched the bioluminescence stay calm and blue. She noted the way 3 of the minor species delegates were already half-turned toward their aides, losing interest. She noted the 2 Keth Confederacy representatives who had brought tablets and were reading something else entirely under the table edge. She did not say anything about the other numbers. The ones not in the document. The ones that had been growing for 20 years in facilities registered under civilian infrastructure classifications, in 17 categories that had no treaty names, because no one had thought to name them, because why would you name a category of weapon if no treaty required you to declare it, if the thing you were building was something nobody had thought to forbid yet? She closed the document when she reached the last disclosed line. "We hope the seat finds this disclosure satisfactory," she said. Her voice had the particular quality of someone who has stopped performing reassurance and simply delivers it, the way a doctor delivers a prognosis they've given 100 times. Vel'Thuz indicated satisfaction. The other delegates registered the disclosure without incident. The session moved to other business. At the very end of Yeva's submitted document, page 41 of 41, in a section titled Supplementary Notes that delegates traditionally skipped because it contained formatting acknowledgments and citation indexes, there were 3 paragraphs. They were clear. They were precise. They used the simplest language she could manage. They stated, without drama and without apology, that Earth's disclosed capability represented a voluntarily constrained operational posture, that the full posture had not been demonstrated and would not be demonstrated except under conditions of what Earth defined specifically, with a numbered list of definitions, as existential provocation. That any party reading the document should consider themselves formally notified of these conditions, these definitions, and the fact of the constraint. Vel'Thuz skipped page 41. Every delegate skipped page 41. Yeva had written it knowing they would. She filed it anyway because the filing was the point. Because when everything else was done, the record would show that the notification had been made and the choice to skip it had been made by someone else. The years that followed had a shape, if you were the kind of person who stood far enough back to see it. 4 years after the disclosure, a Keth Confederacy probe fleet crossed into Earth-flagged space near the Outer Transit Corridor. It was a test. The Keth ran tests the way some species ran, whether constantly, automatically, mostly for data. They wanted response time, fleet deployment speed, communication lag between Earth's outer stations and Central Command. Earth responded in 11 minutes. One ship came out of the transit lane and pulled alongside the probe fleet, 14 vessels, and held position. No weapons powered, no aggressive signal of any kind. It stayed there for 6 hours while the Keth ran their scans and the probe fleet commander filed increasingly puzzled reports back to Confederacy Command. Then Earth's ship transmitted something. Not a warning, not a military demand. A letter, written by a 12-year-old named Siasia Toffa who lived in the outer colony system of Kepler-7 and who had won her school's competition for diplomatic writing 3 years in a row. The letter expressed Earth's sincere hope that the Keth Confederacy was well. It noted, in polite and careful language, that this region of space was under Earth's administrative designation and asked, with genuine courtesy, if there was anything the Keth fleet needed before continuing on its way. The probe fleet left. The Keth filed the incident as non-aggressive, limited capability response. They noted the deployment of a single ship and the transmission of a letter written by a child. They concluded, reasonably, that Earth's outer system reaction force was not a serious strategic concern. They were right about the letter. It had been sent because Yeva's predecessor believed, with the kind of conviction that doesn't explain itself, that the letter should always go first. They were wrong about almost everything else. What they didn't file, because they didn't know to look for it, was what had been sitting in the transit lane behind Earth's ship. In the shadow of a navigational dead zone, at the edge of the probe fleet's sensor range, 11 ships had been running dark on signatures that the Keth's equipment read as background radiation. They had been in position in 4 minutes. The other 7 minutes were travel time for the ship with the letter. The Keth never knew. They filed their report and moved on, and the gap in their knowledge stayed there, unfiled, unnoticed, growing in the dark. 11 years after that, the Galactic Arms Reduction Accords went a full vote. Earth formally requested exemption. The request was denied in committee before it reached the floor. Earth had argued that the accords, as written, created asymmetric risk for species in active development phases. The committee found the argument self-serving. They were not wrong. They did not ask whether it was also true. Earth signed the accords. Yeva's predecessor signed them with a pen that had belonged to a general who had fought in the last war Earth ever fought against itself. A personal detail she shared with no one, because it was the kind of thing people either understood immediately or didn't understand at all, and she didn't have the patience to explain it in that room. Earth signed the accords and then continued its development programs in the 17 unnamed categories, because the accords specified weapon types by name and Earth's programs were not those types. 4 separate legal teams reviewed it. An outside counsel from a neutral species reviewed it independently. All 4 reached the same word. Legal. Not a violation, not a loophole exactly. A gap. The kind that opens when people write rules to cover what they know and don't think to cover what they haven't imagined yet. Earth had found the gap, stepped into it quietly, and been building inside it for 2 decades. 8 years after that, a Dominion expansion fleet passed through the Rethys system. Earth had flagged Rethys as a protected zone in its galactic seat filings 6 years prior. The designation was noted, acknowledged, and given the weight the Dominion gave to the administrative filings of mid-tier species, which was the weight of a formality that didn't have to mean anything unless someone with power decided it did. The expansion fleet was 200 ships moving toward what the Dominion classified as a consolidation operation, their word for the process by which they absorbed smaller systems into their administrative network. The Rethys system had 2 inhabited worlds. Neither had been consulted about the consolidation. This was standard Dominion practice, the kind of standard that gets written into operational manuals when nobody has ever pushed back hard enough to force a rewrite. Earth sent 1 ship. The expansion fleet stopped. 200 ships, 1 Earth vessel, no weapons charged, no aggressive signal, no communication at all beyond a standard positioning hold request, the kind of thing you file when you need a transit lane cleared. The fleet held for 4 hours. Then it turned around. The Dominion's fleet commander filed a report afterward. She noted that Earth's single vessel had exhibited what she characterized as bluff behavior. Classic prey species territorial display, she wrote. She recommended that future routes simply bypass Earth-flagged zones to avoid the bureaucratic inconvenience. She was promoted the following year, and the recommendation became policy. She was right that it was a display. She was wrong about what it was displaying. The 1 ship had spent 4 hours running a continuous passive scan of the expansion fleet's entire configuration. Charge signatures, formation patterns, communication frequencies, hull stress readings, propulsion intervals. All of it filed, not to use immediately, to have. Earth had been filing things like that for 23 years. The folders were very large. 4 years after Rethys, Earth submitted its second formal warning to the galactic seat. It was longer than the first, more specific. It named the existence of the 17 development categories, not their contents, only that they existed, only how long they had been running, only that they were not covered by any existing treaty because existing treaties hadn't known to cover them. It restated the conditions under which Earth's full operational posture would be demonstrated, and it added a sentence that hadn't appeared in the first warning. The sentence said, The demonstration, if it becomes necessary, will not be calibrated for minimal impact. The warning was filed, logged, assigned a reference number. It was not read by anyone with the authority to act on it. The year the Dominion moved on the Lethani Compact, Yeva Solano authorized the evacuation of 3 outer colony systems. She did it quietly. She routed the orders through civilian resettlement channels and labeled them an economic migration initiative. She spaced the departure schedules over 4 months so the population movements wouldn't cluster into a pattern visible on galactic monitoring systems. She used the kind of language in the administrative filings that bureaucracies produce so much of that no one reads it closely. By the time the last transport lifted from the 3rd system, 412,000 people had been relocated. She sat alone afterward in a room where the lights were dimmed, and a cup of tea had gone cold on the table beside her. A secure channel was open to Earth's Central Command, the line quiet except for the soft background noise of systems running. "How long do we have?" someone asked. The voice was young, new to the room in the way that people are new when they haven't yet learned not to let the question sound like hopping. Yeva looked at the cold tea. "Long enough," she said, "if they're smart." She didn't say the other half of the thought, the half that had been sitting behind her sternum for years, in the specific place where certainty you don't want lives, where knowing what's coming and not being able to stop it yet makes a particular kind of weight that has no name. They wouldn't be smart. She had been watching for 31 years. She knew exactly what they would do next because she knew how the Dominion had done it 37 times before, and she knew they had never once believed a warning from a species that hadn't yet shown them a reason to. The problem with holding back, she had learned, was that it looked like nothing. And nothing looked like weakness. And weakness looked like an opportunity. She got up, picked up the cold tea, and drank it anyway. Outside the window, a transport was rising through the upper atmosphere on its way to the resettlement coordinates. One of the last ones, on schedule, labeled economic, nothing to look at. She watched it go until it was a light and then until it wasn't even that. Then she closed the channel, gathered her files, and went back to work. There was still time to do this right. She intended to use every minute of it down to the last one, because the minute after the last one was going to be something else entirely, something she had been preparing for and dreading with equal and specific care since the day she first read the full file, including the margin. Including the 2 words in her own language that the archivists had never been able to identify, written there 31 years ago by the woman who had trained her, who had understood exactly what they were dealing with, and had passed the file forward, and trusted that whoever came next would know what to do with it. Magpijil Pa. Hold back more. She had held back. Earth had held back. 31 years of letters written by children and 1 ship instead of 11, and warnings buried on page 41 of documents nobody read past page 3. 31 years because the thing on the other side of the holding back was something she didn't want to be responsible for starting. But starting and ending were different things. She had always been clear on that. The Dominion's message arrived on a Tuesday. Earth had a mutual defense treaty with the Lethani Compact, not a famous treaty, not one that appeared in the summaries that galactic news services ran when they needed to fill space. It had been signed 14 years ago in a small room with bad lighting and witnessed by 3 people, 2 of whom were now retired. It wasn't famous because the Lethani weren't famous. They were a quiet people who lived on 4 worlds near the outer edge of the Tharsis corridor, and grew something like wheat and made something like music and had, 14 years ago, asked Earth very politely if Earth would be willing to sign a piece of paper that said it would notice if someone was hurting them. Earth had said yes. Earth meant it. When the Dominion moved on the Lethani Compact, not with a declaration, not with a formal absorption vote at the galactic seat, but with 300 ships appearing in Lethani orbital space one morning and staying there, until the Lethani government signed a consolidation agreement. They had not been offered the option to decline. Earth invoked the treaty. The invocation was formal, correctly filed, and sent through the proper diplomatic channels to the Dominion's administrative seat. The Dominion's response took 9 days. When it came, it was 8 words. The Lethani Compact no longer exists. Your treaty is void. Yeva read it twice. Then she set it down on her desk and looked out the window at the sky over the city for a while without saying anything. Then she picked up her files and told her aide to book her a seat at the emergency session of the Galactic Interspecies Seat, full chamber, because she had something to say, and she wanted everyone in the room when she said it. Her aide looked at her face and booked the seat without asking what she was planning to say. The full chamber of the Galactic Interspecies Seat seated representatives from 61 species. Emergency sessions were rare enough that most delegates arrived with the tight, alert energy of people who expected something to happen, something interesting, something worth the disruption to their schedule. Yeva walked in and put her document on the podium and looked at the room. Vel'Thuz was at the center of the deliberative mass, 11 minds rotating through their consensus patterns in smooth, interlocking waves. The bioluminescence was calm, cool blue, slow green, the Velshara expression for a situation already understood, already categorized, already filed under known outcomes. Other delegates were arranging themselves, finding their seats, talking to their aides. The Keth representatives had brought tablets again. 2 of the Sorvian delegates were eating something that smelled like iron. The room had the quality of a theater before the lights go down, full of motion that hasn't found its reason yet. Yeva waited until they settled. Then she opened her document and read the 3rd warning aloud. Not summaries, not highlights, every word, every clause. She read the section that named the 17 development categories and described, in general terms, what those categories contained. She read the section on timeline, how long each program had been running, how long it had been since the first formal warning, how long it had been since the second. She read the section on the Lethani Treaty, the invocation, and the 8-word response. She read the operational posture section, the one about the demonstration not being calibrated for minimal impact, and when she reached it, she slowed down and read each word with a small pause between them, the way you read something to someone who keeps insisting they don't understand what you're saying. She read the final paragraph, which said only, Earth considers this notification complete, and its obligations under the Transparency Accords fully discharged. What follows is no longer a function of diplomacy. She closed the document. 3 things happened at almost the same time. 2 minor species ambassadors requested immediate recess. They did it simultaneously from opposite sides of the chamber without having coordinated it, which meant they had reached the same conclusion independently, which said something. A Sorvian delegate stopped eating and put the food down on the table and didn't pick it up again. The room got quiet in a way it hadn't been quiet in 200 years of sessions, not the polite quiet of people waiting for a speaker to finish, but the other kind. The kind that happens when a room full of intelligent creatures all have the same thought at the same moment, and none of them want to be the first one to say it out loud. Vel'Thuz broke it. The 11 minds moved through their consensus patterns with the smooth confidence of a species that had run this calculation before, on 37 different species, and knew how it ended. The bioluminescence stayed blue, stayed calm. Vel'Thuz said, in translation, that Earth's warning had been received and noted, that it was consistent with documented escalation, behaviors observed in species at Earth's developmental stage, that the Dominion recognized the pattern as a characteristic response to geopolitical pressure and had full confidence in the stability of the current regional order. Pre-species threat escalation behavior, Vel'Thuz called it. The phrase was not dismissive in tone. It was the Velshara equivalent of a clinical observation, the way a doctor names a symptom, not to mock it but simply to file it correctly. The 11 minds had seen this before. They had seen what prey species did when they felt cornered. They had watched species 3 times Earth's size make exactly this kind of noise in the last stages before accepting consolidation. The noise never meant what it sounded like it meant. It always resolved the same way. Yeva looked at Vel'Thuz. She held that look for a moment that was not long by any objective measure, but had a different quality than the moments around it. The way certain silences have a weight that the noise on either side of them doesn't. She closed her folder. "Well," she said, "there it is." She picked up the folder, stepped down from the podium and walked out of the chamber. Not in anger, not in performance. She walked the way someone walks when they have done every single thing they were supposed to do, and the outcome has now passed out of their hands and into the hands of other people and other forces, and the walking out is simply the logical next step. The room stayed quiet for another few seconds after the door closed behind her. Then the 2 ambassadors who had requested recess left. Then the Sorvian delegate looked at the food he'd set down, decided against it, and put it in his bag. Then the noise started again, delegates talking to aides, filing response reports, generating the bureaucratic record of a session that most of them were already composing explanations for in their heads, explanations that made what had just happened fit neatly into something they already understood. Vel'Thuz processed the session, reached consensus in 0.3 seconds, and filed it under known pattern, resolved trajectory. That was a Tuesday. The 72 hours that followed were quiet on Earth's end. Too quiet. Vel'Thuz noticed this on the second day. Not immediately, it had other matters requiring consensus. The Dominion's expansion across the Tharsis corridor was ahead of schedule, and the administrative machinery of absorbing new systems required attention. There were consolidation agreements to finalize, resource assessments to process, new population registrations to manage. The Dominion was a large operation, and Vel'Thuz was at the center of it, 11 minds keeping the whole thing moving in the deliberate, efficient way it had moved for 4,000 years. But on the second day, one of the 11 minds noted the shape of Earth's communication silence. Not the silence itself. Silences were common. Species went quiet before major decisions, before internal political events, before seasonal shifts in their administrative cycles. This silence was a different shape. Most silences had a texture, low-level communication traffic still running on secondary channels, administrative signals, routine position pings from flagged systems, the background noise that any active civilization generated just by existing. The texture of a political silence was different from the texture of a communications failure, which was different from the texture of deliberate operational quiet. Vel'Thuz's monitoring systems were picking up the texture of deliberate operational quiet. Not on military channels, on every channel. The administrative traffic that should have been running between Earth's outer colonies was running, but thin, reduced. The kind of reduction that happened when a system was being carefully managed rather than simply operating. Someone was keeping Earth's signal profile looking normal without generating the normal volume of noise. The 11th mind filed this as a notation, not a concern, a notation. The other 10 minds were already moving toward the next item on the agenda. Vel'Thuz reached consensus in 0.4 seconds. The notation was filed. The session continued. On the third day, intelligence arrived confirming that Earth had made no defensive fleet movements, no ships repositioned, no stations powered to elevated status, no changes to any registered military installation. This was the correct intelligence. It was accurate. Every data point was real. What the intelligence didn't capture, what it couldn't capture because it was looking for things that moved and things that changed, was the thing that had already moved, already changed, months ago, before the Lethani, before the Dominion had decided to consolidate the Tharsis corridor, before the 8-word response, before any of it. The 412,000 people were already gone. The facilities with no treaty names had already been running for 20 years. The dark ships in the transit lanes had already been in position for longer than the Dominion had been watching. The third warning had been filed. Everything that needed to be in place was in place. Earth wasn't moving because Earth was done moving. The 11 minds of Vel'Thuz did not know this. The notation stayed filed. The session continued. On the 73rd hour, the Dominion strike fleet crossed into Earth-flagged space. 340 ships. The flagship was called the Patient Majority Asterisk, named for the Velshara philosophical concept that the largest number of minds in agreement constituted the correct course of action. It was a good name for a flagship, Vel'Thuz had always thought. It said something true about how the Dominion understood itself. The target was a colony called Meridian Station, an outer settlement, 50,000 residents, enough civilian population to make the strike a message without being large enough to constitute an atrocity by galactic legal standards. The Dominion had run this operation 37 times on 37 species. One demonstration strike. Targeted infrastructure, limited casualties, maximum political signal. After the strike, the affected species understood that the Dominion's warnings were real and their own warnings were not, and the consolidation proceeded. It had always worked. It worked because species, when they felt true power directed at them, recalibrated their threat assessments. The noise they had been making before the strike was replaced with the more useful noise of negotiation. The pattern was consistent across 37 data points and 4,000 years. Vel'Thuz was not worried. On Earth, in a room where the lights had been kept dim for 3 days and the same secure channel had been open and quiet for most of that time, Yeva Solano received confirmation that the Dominion fleet had crossed the line. She looked at the coordinates on the display. She looked at the time. She picked up a tablet and entered a 12-digit authorization code. The code had no name. It had a designation, a string of numbers and letters that referred to a specific operational file, but the file itself had a title in Old Filipino that translated loosely as a phrase that wasn't really a phrase, more of a breath. The kind of sound a person makes when they've been holding something very heavy for a very long time and they've finally decided to put it down. She entered the code. She confirmed it. Then she set the tablet on the table and sat back in her chair and looked at the ceiling, which had a water stain in the upper left corner that she had been looking at for 3 days without really seeing it. And now she saw it, and it looked exactly like what it was, a mark left by something that had happened a long time ago and hadn't been fixed because there were always more pressing things to attend to. How long? The young aide's voice said from somewhere behind her. 19 days, Yeva said, maybe less. A pause. Is that the aide started? Yes, Yeva said before the question could finish forming. It's enough. She didn't explain what it was enough for, because explaining it would have required describing things she had spent 31 years carefully not describing to people who didn't need to know yet. The time for that was over now. What came next would describe itself. Outside, the planet went about its business. Traffic moved. Lights came on in the windows of 1,000 buildings. Somewhere in Lagos, a woman was watching a transport rise through the upper atmosphere, not knowing it was the last civilian transport that would use that corridor for a while, not knowing anything was different about this particular evening, because that was precisely how it had been arranged. The strike fleet was still moving. The code was entered. 31 years of holding back was exactly 31 years long. Tonight it ended. The drop pod smelled like recycled air, and someone else's fear, and Deo Okonkwo was absolutely, completely, categorically fine. He told himself this at regular intervals, the way you repeat something until the repetition itself becomes a kind of proof. He was fine. Sergeant Deo Okonkwo was fine. Sergeant Okonkwo had done this 38 times on 4 different deployments, and he was not, absolutely not, sitting in a drop pod with his grandmother's prayer beads wrapped around his left fist, so tight the beads were leaving marks in his palm. Except he was doing exactly that. The beads were old, brown wooden ones, worn smooth in the places his grandmother's fingers had worn them smooth before him, which meant they had the particular texture of something that had been held through hard things many times by people who needed something to hold. He hadn't used them for prayer since he was 12. He carried them on every deployment because his grandmother had given them to him the morning he shipped out the first time, pressing them into his hand without ceremony, and then immediately changing the subject, which was how she expressed almost everything important. He held them now and watched the red light on the pod ceiling, and listened to the sounds of 11 other soldiers breathing in the dark around him. "Brother," said Private Essie Asant from the seat to his right, "you are holding those beads like they owe you money." "I'm not holding anything," Deo said. "Sergeant Okonkwo is sitting in complete tactical composure. Sergeant Okonkwo is sweating through his collar. That's the recycled air. That's not what that is." Deo did not argue the point. He looked at the red light and thought about other things. He thought about the briefing, which had been short in ways that briefings were not usually short. His commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Adiz Mbeki, was not a short briefing kind of officer. She was the kind who drew diagrams, who used the full whiteboard, who had opinions about margins. This briefing had been 4 sentences. The fleet engages. You observe from the pod. When the green light comes on, you drop. Your job on the ground is to be a human being standing on a surface. Deo had waited for the 5th sentence, the one with the tactical objective, the target coordinates, the rules of engagement. There was no 5th sentence. "What does that mean?" he'd said. "Be a human being standing on a surface." "It means," Mbeki had said, "that your boots on that ground are the message. That's the whole mission. You land, you stand there, you are visible to their surveillance systems, and you do not leave until I tell you to leave. And the fighting will be handled," she said. "That's not your part." He had wanted very badly to ask what his part was the part of exactly, and what was doing the handling, and several other questions that the expression on Mbeki's face made clear were not going to get useful answers. So he'd taken his squad to the prep bay, checked his kit, found his grandmother's beads in the front pocket of his pack where they always were, and put them on his wrist. That was 3 hours ago. The red light was still red. In the space above the Lethani world of Vashari, the Dominion strike fleet finished its approach formation at 3:40 hours ship time. 340 vessels, the asterisk patient majority at the center, flanked by 2 destroyer lines and a screen of fast intercept craft running the outer edge of the formation. It was a precise arrangement, developed over centuries of consolidation operations, tested against 37 different species' defensive configurations, and found effective against all of them. The Dominion's tactical systems ran final threat assessment on Earth's registered defensive assets in the region. 38 warship classes, numbers as disclosed. The assessment took 11 seconds. Low threat, manageable engagement, proceed. Earth ships came out of the transit lane at 3:41. They looked exactly like the assessment said they would. Correct hull types, registered configurations, numbers consistent with what Earth had disclosed at the galactic seat. The Dominion's tactical officers watched their screens and saw exactly what they expected to see, and for 4 minutes the engagement unfolded the way their models said it would. 4 minutes. Inside the drop pod, the ship shuddered once. A long, slow vibration that moved through the hull like something very large had changed speed very deliberately. Deo felt it in his back teeth. "That's us slowing down," Essie said from beside him. "I know what it is. You got the beads out again." "I never put them away." The red light stayed red. Deo breathed. Sergeant Okonkwo breathed. They were the same person breathing, and they were both doing it too fast, and the recycled air still smelled like someone else's fear. And now it smelled like his too, probably, if he was being honest with himself, which he was trying not to be. On the screens in the Dominion's tactical center, at 3:45 hours, something changed. The ships coming out of the transit lane stopped looking like the assessment. They stopped looking like any assessment. They had no hull markings, no classification the Dominion systems recognized. They ran on propulsion signatures that the detection equipment had no category for, not unknown in the way that a new variant is unknown, but unknown in the way that something is unknown when it was never supposed to exist, when no one filing the treaty names had thought to reserve a classification for it. The Dominion systems ran identification protocols and returned a result they had not returned in 4,000 years of operational history. No match found. Not low match, not partial match, no match. There were ships in the lane that did not exist, by any record the Dominion had ever built, and they were dark and dense in a way that made the sensor screens look wrong, like looking at something your eyes know how to see but your brain hasn't made the right shape for yet. The Dominion fleet commander gave orders. The orders were correct. The tactical response was the response of an experienced military engaging a novel threat: redirect, reassess, pull the defensive formation that had won every engagement in the Dominion's history. It was the right formation for enemies who were trying to win the engagement. The drop pod shuddered again, harder this time. Then a third time. Then it stopped shuddering, which was somehow worse, because the stillness that replaced it had a quality like the stillness before a very loud sound. Deo looked at the red light. The red light looked back. "Brother," he said, not to Essie, not to anyone specific, just into the pod, just to have something in the air that wasn't the breathing. Nobody answered. The silence lasted 11 more seconds. Then the light went green. He didn't see what happened to the fleet. The pod dropped, and the world outside the viewport was fire and motion, and the upper atmosphere of Vashari, catching the light of its star in streaks of orange and gold. And he was pressed back in his seat with his fist around his grandmother's beads and his eyes on the porthole, and his brain doing what brains do in drop pods, which is absolutely nothing useful. It was Essie who saw it first, from the porthole on the other side. "Deo," she said. Her voice was a different shape than usual, not scared, not excited, something without a name that sat between those two things and didn't belong to either of them. "Deo, look." He leaned across and looked through her porthole. The Dominion fleet was coming apart. Not burning, not exploding in the way that things exploded when they were hit by weapons, he understood. Not breaking along structural lines the way ships broke when they were stressed past their limits. Coming apart. At seams, at places that shouldn't have been seams, in geometries that made the back of his mind want to stop processing what he was seeing and file it under something else, something less difficult to hold. The shapes the ships made as they came apart were not the shapes of things being destroyed. They were the shapes of things being, he didn't have the word, renegotiated. Like the matter inside them had been asked a question it had never been asked before and was in the process of answering. 340 ships. He watched. He held the beads. "Brother," he said, for the second time, and this time the word came out the way it comes out when the thing in front of you is real and you need someone nearby to confirm it. "Listen." He didn't finish. The pod hit the outer atmosphere and the porthole turned orange, and there was nothing to see but fire. Vashari had a sky the color of something between blue and green, in the particular shade that happens on worlds with different atmospheric compositions than Earth. Not wrong, just shifted, like a familiar song in a different key. The city they landed near was called Athasev in the Lethani language, which translated roughly as asterisk the place where two rivers decide. It was mid-sized. It had been occupied by the Dominion for 7 months. 7 months of occupation had left it in the specific state that occupations leave places, still standing mostly, but with the quality of something that has been held very still for a very long time against its nature. The streets smelled like ozone and something sweet underneath it that Deo couldn't name. He walked with his squad in a loose formation, rifle carried but not raised, safety on. The mission parameters were the same as the briefing: be visible, be human, be on the ground. He didn't know what to do with his hands. He had never had a mission where the tactical requirement was to simply exist in a place, and the not knowing what to do with his hands was the most disorienting part of it. In every other deployment he'd done, his hands had a job. Now they had his rifle, which wasn't being used, and each other, and his grandmother's beads, which he had coiled around his wrist and kept touching with his thumb the way you keep touching a sore tooth. Dominion surveillance drones moved in slow circles overhead. Big ones, the kind designed to transmit high-resolution footage to command ships in orbit, the kind with enough range to bounce a signal off a relay station and put clear images on a screen somewhere very far away. They had been circling since before the pod landed. They were circling now. He looked up at one. It was about 40 meters up, moving in a slow, even arc. Its sensor array pointed down at the streets below with the patient attention of something that didn't get tired. It passed over him and he tracked it with his eyes, and then, without entirely deciding to, he raised his hand. He waved. Not a signal wave, not a tactical wave. The wave his grandmother used to do from the observation deck of Lagos Station when passenger ships passed in the transit corridor. A loose, open-handed movement that didn't mean anything specific except asterisk I see you and I am acknowledging the seeing. The kind of wave that says, you are not invisible to me, and I am not invisible to you, and here we both are. The drone circled. Its sensors tracked him. Its footage transmitted up through the atmosphere and into the relay systems, and eventually, in formats he would never see, onto screens very far away. He held the wave for a moment, then he put his hand down. "Did you just wave at a surveillance drone?" Essie said from behind him. Sergeant Okonkwo was acknowledging the operational environment. Sergeant Okonkwo waved at a drone. The environment, Deo said, acknowledged back. Essie looked at the drone. The drone continued its arc. "It didn't do anything," she said. "It kept watching," he said. "That's the same thing." He started walking again. His boots on the stone of Athasev made the same sound boots always made: flat, deliberate, real. And he let himself focus on that for a while because it was something simple and grounded, and he had just watched 340 ships come apart at the seams in geometries that didn't have names, and his grandmother's prayer beads were worn smooth in all the right places, and the sky was the wrong color, and the street smelled like ozone and something sweet. He walked. He was visible. He was a human being standing on a surface. Whatever that meant, he was doing it, and somewhere in orbit the footage was transmitting, and somewhere further away than orbit, it would eventually reach a set of 11 minds that had spent 4,000 years watching species make noise before they went quiet. And those minds would look at the footage of a soldier in a street waving at a drone, and they would try to file it under something they already understood. Deo didn't know this. He was just walking. The city was very quiet around him. The occupation had made it quiet in a way he felt in his chest, the particular quiet of a place that has been holding its breath for 7 months and doesn't know yet that it's allowed to stop. At the end of the block, a Lethani child appeared in a doorway, small, 5 or 6 maybe, with the large compound eyes that the Lethani had and the very still way they held themselves when they were uncertain. The child looked at Deo. Deo looked back. He raised his hand. He waved. The child stared at him for a long moment with the enormous, still eyes. Then, very slowly, with the careful deliberateness of someone trying a thing they hadn't done before, the child raised one of its 4 hands and waved back. Deo felt something happen in the region of his sternum that he was going to decline to name or discuss, ever, including with himself, because he had a professional reputation to maintain, and because it was the kind of thing that hit you when you were already stretched thin and already holding prayer beads that weren't yours originally, and already processing a sky that was the wrong color, and 340 ships coming apart in ways that didn't have categories. He kept walking. His boots made their sound on the stone. Behind him in the relay, the footage kept transmitting. Up through atmosphere, through the relay stations, through the long channels of light and signal that connected occupied worlds to command centers to archive systems to the 11-minded deliberative consciousness of the High Chorus Vel'Thas, who was a very long way away, and who had spent 4,000 years never once losing a war, and who would watch this footage 11 times before the next day was done and would not, for the first time in 4,000 years, know what to do with it. Deo didn't know any of that. He was thinking about his grandmother. He was thinking that he should call her when this was over, before she heard about it on the news feeds, because she was going to hear about it on the news feeds, and the version the news feeds had was not going to be a calm version. He was thinking that, when he called, she would ask him 3 questions, and he would answer all 3 of them wrong, and she would sigh the specific sigh that meant she knew he was lying, and was choosing not to press it this time. He was thinking that, when he got home, he needed to buy new prayer beads because he'd had hers for 11 years, and the surface of them was down to almost nothing, and at some point, a person needed to return what they borrowed, even when the borrowing had been a gift, even when the return felt like the wrong direction. The street opened into a square. He stopped in the middle of it. He stood there, in the square of a city that smelled like ozone and something sweet, under a sky that was the wrong color, with a surveillance drone moving in a slow arc overhead and his grandmother's beads around his wrist and his boots flat on the stone. He was a human being standing on a surface. He was the message. He still didn't entirely know what the message said. But whatever it said, it was transmitting. The Dominion had not lost a war in 4,000 years. This was not luck. It was not even in the strictest sense a military achievement. It was the result of a very simple principle applied with absolute consistency across 4 millennia of expansion. The Dominion never engaged an enemy it had not already defeated in every way that mattered before the first shot was fired. By the time a consolidation fleet crossed into a system, the outcome had already been decided at the level of mathematics, numbers, ratios, resource differentials. The shooting was not the war. The shooting was the announcement of the war's conclusion. The Vel'Shara understood this the way they understood everything, through the consensus of 11 minds, each processing simultaneously, none of them capable of being fully wrong, because the aggregate of 11 perspectives smoothed out individual error the way a wide river smooths out the irregularities of its bed. 4,000 years had proved the method sound. 37 species had proved it sound. Every engagement, every consolidation, every demonstration strike had resolved the same way because the mathematics said it would, and the mathematics had never been wrong. In 19 days, the Dominion lost 31 fleet engagements. Not 31 ships. 31 fleets. Vel'Thas received the reports the way it received all data, simultaneously, across all 11 minds, processed and categorized and filed before the information had fully finished transmitting. The first 3 reports it absorbed without significant disruption to consensus. Anomalies occurred. Equipment performed unexpectedly. These were known variables, accounted for in the Dominion's operational models as a margin of acceptable deviation. By the seventh report, the consensus was taking 0.9 seconds instead of 0.3. By the 15th, it was taking 4 seconds. By the 22nd, Vel'Thuz had stopped filing the results under anomaly and opened a new category. It did not have a name for the new category yet. This in itself was unusual enough to note. In 4,000 years of operation, every outcome had fit an existing category. The categories had been built from experience, and they had been comprehensive, and they had never needed extending. Vel'Thuz extended them. On the 19th day, the 31st report arrived. Vel'Thuz processed it across 11 minds, reached consensus, and then did something it had not done in any engagement in its recorded operational history. It stopped, held the consensus open, and went back to the beginning. The models were wrong. This was the first conclusion, and it was not by itself the difficult one. Models could be wrong. Models were built on available data, and available data had limits. Any sufficiently advanced intelligence updated its models when the evidence required it. This was not failure. This was function. The difficult part was understanding how the models were wrong. Not what they had missed about Earth's capability. That was becoming clear from the engagement reports, growing clearer with each one, building a picture that Vel'Thuz's 11 minds were still in the process of assembling. The capability question was solvable. Given enough data and enough processing time, the full shape of what Earth had built would become legible. What was not becoming clear, what was growing less clear the more data arrived, was Earth's intent. The Dominion's models were built around a fundamental assumption about why species fought. They fought for territory, for resources, for survival, for dominance, for the removal of a threat. Every species in the Dominion's 4,000 years of expansion had fought for one or more of these things, and once you understood which one a species was fighting for, you understood what would satisfy them. You understood the terms that would end the fighting. You understood the shape of the resolution. Earth was not fighting for any of these things. This was the conclusion Vel'Thuz arrived at on the 19th day, after 31 reports, after 4 seconds of consensus instead of 0.3. And it was the most disorienting conclusion its 11 minds had ever reached, because it had no category, no precedent, no historical parallel in 4,000 years of records. Earth wasn't trying to win the engagement. Earth had already won the engagement. Earth was doing something else entirely. 3 intelligence files. Vel'Thuz reviewed them in sequence, because sequence was the only way to process things that did not resolve into clean parallel categories. The first had been intercepted from Earth's command network on the opening day of engagement. A transmission between the fleet commander and her tactical officers, 15 minutes before the second layer of Earth's assets became visible. The transmission had been encrypted, but Dominion intelligence had broken Earth's encryption standard in the 3rd year of monitoring, which they considered a significant intelligence achievement and had never shared, because there was no reason to share it with a species that wasn't worth worrying about. The transmission translated, "Don't take the ships. We want them to see the ships. We want them to be able to tell someone what they saw, keep them intact enough to transmit." Vel'Thuz processed this 11 times. Each time, the same result. Earth's fleet commander, in the first minutes of an engagement in which her military had deployed capabilities no other species knew existed, had given orders not to destroy the enemy fleet. To witness it. She wanted witnesses. The Dominion's model for combat had no category for an enemy that wanted you to survive long enough to report what you had seen. No category for a military whose primary objective in opening engagement was the production of testimony. The model assumed you won and then told the story yourself. It did not account for a species that wanted the other side to tell the story, in their own words, from the experience of having been present. Vel'Thuz held this conclusion in consensus for 7 seconds. Then it opened the second file. The second file was the evacuation order. Vel'Thuz had known about the evacuations, the intelligence had flagged them, had categorized them as economic migration, had filed them and moved on. What the intelligence had not done was correlate the dates. The evacuation of Earth's outer colonies had been authorized 6 months before the Dominion moved on the Lethani Compact. Not 6 months before the engagement began. 6 months before the Dominion made any decision to move on the Lethani, before the internal vote that approved the consolidation, before the operational planning began, before any of the meetings in which the Dominion had decided privately that the Tharsis corridor was the next target. Earth had begun evacuating its civilians before the Dominion knew it was going to do the thing that would start the war. Vel'Thuz processed this across 11 minds, and the consensus took 9 seconds, and when it finished, what it produced was not a filed conclusion but a question, which was itself unprecedented. Because in 4,000 years of operation, the Vel'Shara consensus process had never produced a question it could not immediately answer. The question was how. Not how had they known. The intelligence failure was clear and would be addressed. The question was a different kind of how, the how that sits under the surface of events and asks about the nature of the thing rather than its mechanics. How long had Earth been watching? How long had it been preparing? How long had it been sitting with the knowledge of what was coming, and the capability to respond to it, and the patience to wait until the moment was exactly right? The evacuation had been authorized 6 months before the Dominion decided to move. Earth's development programs had been running for 20 years. The first formal warning had been filed 31 years ago. 31 years. Vel'Thuz held that number in 11 simultaneous minds and felt something that it did not have a word for in its own language, because it had never needed one. The Vel'Shara had words for the confidence that came from numerical superiority, words for the satisfaction of a consolidation completed, words for the smooth certainty of a consensus reached across 11 minds without deviation. It did not have a word for the specific sensation of understanding, for the first time, that you had been watched by something patient for longer than you had been watching it. It opened the third file. The footage was 47 seconds long. A ground-level view from a surveillance drone in low orbit over Athasev, Vashari's third-largest city. The drone had been transmitting continuously since before the drop pods made landfall. The footage was clear, high resolution, stable, well lit by the local star. Standard operational surveillance. Vel'Thuz had reviewed thousands of hours of footage like it from 37 different consolidation operations. For the first 40 seconds, it showed streets, buildings, the particular stillness of a city under military presence. Then a human soldier walked into the frame. Young, male, moving in the loose way that soldiers moved when they were not actively in contact, present but not braced. He wore full kit but carried his weapon low, safety configuration, nothing charged. He walked to the center of a wide open square and stopped. He looked up at the drone. Vel'Thuz watched with 11 minds. The soldier raised his hand. He waved. It was not a signal. Vel'Thuz ran analysis on the gesture across 6 different communication pattern databases: military signaling, territorial marking, challenge display, submission gesture, the 17 categories of nonverbal combat communication that the Dominion had cataloged across all known species. The gesture matched none of them. It was an open hand, raised and moved in a slow arc, directed at the drone with no tactical purpose that any of Vel'Thuz's 11 minds could identify. It was, the analysis determined, an acknowledgement. The soldier was acknowledging that the drone was there, that the drone was watching, that the soldier knew he was being watched and was not accepting it, not ignoring it, not performing for it, simply nodding it. The way you note the presence of another creature because the creature is there and present, and ignoring it would be the stranger choice. The soldier who had just stood in a city his species had liberated in 19 days from a fleet the Dominion had spent 4,000 years believing was unbeatable. This soldier looked up at a surveillance camera and waved hello. Vel'Thuz watched the footage 11 times. On the 11th viewing, the 11th mind did something no Velshara mind had done in any recorded moment of their history. It stopped. Not the consensus, not the process. The mind itself stopped in the middle of the viewing in the frame where the soldier's hand was raised, and it sat there in the lattice of the other 10 minds like a note held past its resolution, present, connected but separate, not agreeing, not disagreeing, simply stopped. The other 10 minds waited. The consensus tried to form. Could not. The 11th mind had found something. Not in the footage, in the archive, in the long, cold crystalline stacks where 700 years of expansion records lived, where a 31-year-old file sat stamped low priority, monitor only, where the initial contact report on a Class 3 emerging species lived in the section for things that weren't yet worth worrying about. The 11th mind had found the margin note. The 2 handwritten words in an alphabet the archivists had flagged as unidentified and never investigated, because there was no reason to investigate the margin annotations of a first contact report for a species that ranked below threshold. No reason until now. The 11th mind had run the alphabet against a database that the other 10 had not thought to check, not military intelligence, not galactic diplomatic records, but a linguistic archive compiled by a small research institute that cataloged dying and minority languages from species across the known systems. The archive was 312 years old. It had been compiled by a Velshara academic, whose particular interest was in what languages could tell you about the species that spoke them. The alphabet was in the archive. The language was called Tagalog. It was spoken on Earth, specifically in a region called the Philippines, on the planet's primary ocean continent. The archive listed it as a living language with approximately 90 million speakers, regional and co-official status, historical significance, and several notes about its grammatical structure and its tendency toward words that compressed complex states into single, precise expressions. The margin note said, Magpijil Pa. The translation, hold back more. The 11th mind held this in its separated stillness in the lattice. The other 10 minds waited. The translation was simple. The words were simple, but the 11th mind was sitting with the weight of them, specifically with the date on the first contact file, which was 31 years ago, and the handwriting in the margin, which was small and careful and clearly internal. The kind of notation you made for yourself or for whoever came after you, not for the people you were writing about. Someone had stood on Earth 31 years ago, before the Dominion had made contact, before there was any formal relationship between the 2 civilizations, before any of the warnings had been filed or any development programs had been running. Someone had stood there with knowledge of what was watching from the sky and had written a reminder in the margin of a file. Hold back more. Not a threat, not a declaration, a reminder, the kind of thing you wrote when you were talking to yourself, when you were maintaining a discipline that required active maintenance because the natural impulse was different. Hold back more. The natural impulse, the thing they were holding back from, was not in the note. It didn't need to be. You only wrote hold back more if the more was considerable. If the more was something you had been restraining for longer than the watching had been happening. The 11th mind sat in the lattice for 3 seconds. In Velshara consciousness, 3 seconds was the length of a long life's worth of thinking. The other 10 minds felt the separation, not like a break, not like damage, but like a door that had always been theoretically possible and had never in 4,000 years been opened and was now slightly ajar. The thought the 11th mind was forming was this. The Dominion had spent 4,000 years believing that the most dangerous thing in a consolidation was the species that showed you everything it had. The ones that didn't try to hide their capability, that brought full force immediately, that gave you no window for assessment. This was wrong. The most dangerous thing in a consolidation was a species that could show you everything, and chose, for 31 years, not to. Not because it was weak. Not because it was afraid, because it was deciding. The 37 species the Dominion had absorbed had never been deciding. They had been reacting, assessing, surviving, doing what living things do when force is applied to them. Earth had been deciding. For 31 years, Earth had been deciding how much to show and when to show it and what to do after, and the answer to what to do after was apparently, evacuate your civilians, enter the code, and then send a soldier to stand in a city square and wave at a drone. The 11 minds finally, shakily, reached a partial consensus. The partial consensus said, we will draft surrender terms and appeal to the galactic seat for mediated settlement. The 11th mind rejoined the lattice, accepted the consensus. But it kept the note. Magpijil pa. It kept it the way you keep a thing that has changed the shape of what you thought you understood. Not filed, not categorized, just held in the part of a mind where things live when they are too important to put down and too large to fully carry. The Dominion's surrender terms began to form. Outside, the 31st Fleet report sat in the archive, next to 30 others, next to a first contact file that was 31 years old. The soldier in the footage still had his hand raised. The drone was still watching. The acknowledgement was still transmitting. Yeva Solano walked back into the galactic interspecies seat on a Thursday morning and sat down in the same chair she had sat in for 12 years. Same chair, same table, same room with the ceiling that curved up in a way to make everyone feel equally small, which had stopped working on her in year 7 and had stopped being something she thought about in year 9. The light still came from everywhere and cast no shadows. The air was still recalibrated every 8 minutes. The room was still full of representatives from species that breathed different things and sat in different configurations and processed information through architectures that had very little in common with each other, except the single fact that they were all here, in this room, waiting to hear what Earth wanted. She was 54 years old. She had been 54 for about 6 months and had not yet adjusted to it in the way that ages sometimes required adjustment. She looked the same as she had the last time she sat in this chair, gray hair, careful face, the posture of someone who had learned a long time ago that the way you held your body in a room told people things before you opened your mouth, and had decided to be deliberate about what it told them. She did not look triumphant. She looked tired. Not the tired that sleep fixed. The other kind, the kind that lived at a level below sleep. That was the result of carrying something heavy for so long that putting it down didn't immediately feel like relief. It felt first like the absence of a familiar weight. And the absence of a familiar weight, when the weight had been yours for 31 years, felt strange before it felt like anything else. She put her folder on the table. She looked at the room. 61 delegations. Every major power, most of the minor ones, and several species who had never attended a full session before, and were here now because the thing that had happened in 19 days was the kind of thing that made species who had been keeping their heads down decide they needed to know what came next. Vel'Thuz was at the center of the deliberative mass. The bioluminescence was different than it had been the last time Yeva sat across from it, not the calm blue of total consensus. Something more complicated, colors she didn't have words for in any language she spoke, moving in patterns that were slower than usual and less synchronized. The 11 minds not quite running in the perfect unison they had always shown before. 3 weeks ago she would not have known how to read that. Now she thought she understood it, at least partly. One of those minds was holding something it hadn't put down. She understood the feeling. The rest of the room had the quality of people who had run the numbers and were now waiting to hear if their numbers were right. Wargaming a peace settlement was something every intelligence service in the room had done in the past 19 days. They had looked at what Earth had demonstrated, and they had asked what a species with that kind of capability would want from a position of total victory. The answers had been consistent across most of the assessments. Territory, the Tharsis corridor and surrounding systems likely, resource concessions, mineral rights, transit fees, priority lane access, mandatory defense treaties rewritten in Earth's favor, permanent military presence in key systems as a deterrent against future challenges, tribute payments calibrated to the scale of the engagement, symbolic submissions, the kind that got recorded in history and referenced for centuries afterward, whenever a species needed to explain why a particular power was not to be tested. This was what victory looked like. This was what it had always looked like. 37 times over 4,000 years, this was the shape of things after a stronger force made its point. Yeva opened her folder. She read Earth's terms. The first term, the Lethani survivors were to be resettled on their original worlds with full sovereignty restored. Dominion infrastructure built during the occupation was to remain in place and operational, maintained at Dominion expense, for a minimum of 30 years or until the Lethani determined they no longer required it. Earth would administer nothing. Earth would take nothing from Lethani space. Earth would not station forces there, would not establish monitoring posts, would not require treaty obligations from the Lethani in exchange for the restoration. The Lethani would simply have their worlds back. A Sorvian delegate made a small sound, not a word, just the sound of a calculation completing and producing an unexpected result. The second term, the Galactic Arms Reduction Accords were to be renegotiated, not amended, renegotiated from the beginning with the explicit requirement that every signatory disclose their actual military capability, not the capability they chose to present, not the capability that fit the existing treaty language, but the real number. Every ship, every weapon type, including categories that no treaty had previously named, every development program. Earth would go first. The full disclosure. Everything. There was a longer silence after this one, the kind of silence that came not from shock but from the rapid, private recalculation of what full disclosure would mean for the species doing the recalculating. Several delegates made eye contact with their aides. One delegation requested a brief pause to confer, which was granted, and which Yeva used to take a drink of water and look at the ceiling with the expression of someone who had been in this room too many times to find the architecture impressive. The third term, a new permanent office to be established within the galactic seat structure. Its name in Earth's proposed charter was the Office of Formal Notification, or in the working language of the document, the Early Warning Seat. Its function, as described, was simple. When a species filed a formal warning with the galactic seat, someone from the Office of Formal Notification would read it, not file it, not log it and assign it a reference number. Read it, in its entirety, including page 41. This term produced the only moment in the session that came close to disrupting the formal atmosphere of the room. Not laughter, something adjacent to it, the sound of a thing being recognized. Two delegates had to cover their mouths. One Keth representative looked at the table with an expression that might, in a different context, have been called embarrassed. Yeva waited for the room to settle. She read the fourth term. The fourth term had no corresponding demand on Earth's behalf. The fourth term was a list. 37 names. Species names, system designations, dates of consolidation, and specific categories of what the Dominion owed each of them. Not owed to Earth, not filtered through Earth's administration, not managed by any Earth-affiliated body. Owed directly. Paid directly. Resource restoration, infrastructure rebuilding, sovereignty documentation, economic compensation calculated by a methodology the document described in detail across 11 pages. 37 species, 37 sets of terms, 37 different shapes of debt. Earth had compiled the list. Earth had done the math. Earth was not collecting any of it. The room was quiet in the same way it had been quiet when Yeva read the third warning aloud. Not the polite quiet of people waiting, but the quiet that happened when intelligent creatures all reached the same point at the same time and needed a moment before the next thing. Vel'Thuz broke it. The 11 minds moved through their patterns, slower than 4 weeks ago, less perfectly synchronized, but moving, reaching for the consensus that was the Velshara way of interacting with a situation. The bioluminescence pulsed through several colors Yeva couldn't name before settling into something that was neither the confident blue of before nor anything she had a reference for. Vel'Thuz asked, in translation, what Earth wanted in return. Not for the Dominion, not specifically. In return. For all of it. For the 19 days. For the 31 fleets. For the third warning that had been read aloud and the 2 words in a margin and the dark ships with no treaty names and all of it. What was the shape of what Earth wanted on the other side? Yeva looked at Vel'Thuz. She held that look for a moment, not performing it, not letting it mean more than it meant, just looking, the way you look at something when you want to remember it accurately later. To go home, she said, and to not have to come back. The session continued. Procedural responses were filed. Working groups were appointed to handle the logistics of the Lethani restoration, the Accords renegotiation, the establishment of the new office. The Dominion's formal acceptance of the terms was recorded in the official transcript with the correct reference numbers and the appropriate signatures. Everything that needed to happen for the record happened. Yeva answered questions. She clarified language in the terms where delegates asked for clarification. She was patient in the way that she was always patient, not warm, not cold, just present doing the work. She was almost through it. She was almost at the part where she picked up her folder and walked out for the last time, and got on the transport home, and slept for approximately 3 days before her aide started putting things back on her calendar. Then the smallest delegation in the room spoke. They were called the Vethani, 3 representatives of a species that had been admitted to the galactic seat 9 years ago, and had spent most of those 9 years being very careful and very quiet, watching the larger powers with the patient attention of a species that understood exactly what it was and what it wasn't and had made its peace with that. They had 2 small worlds in a system that nobody particularly wanted. They had been watching the 19 days the way small species watch things that happen between large ones, carefully, from the side, taking very good notes. One of their representatives, a young one by the look of them, though Yeva had never learned to read Vethani ages accurately, had been reading through the full disclosure documents since Yeva had submitted them at the session's opening. The ones Earth had promised to provide first. The real numbers. Every program, every category, every ship, every capability that had been built in the unnamed categories for 20 years and kept off every treaty and every disclosure until now. The young representative looked up from the documents. They looked at Yeva. They said, in translation that was careful and slow, because the translation system was still building its Vethani vocabulary. You had this for how long? The room heard it. Everyone heard it. The question landed in the air of the chamber with the particular weight of a question that a lot of people in the room had been not asking, and hearing it asked out loud made it real in a different way. Yeva looked at the young representative. She saw what she recognized, not fear exactly, but the thing next to fear, the thing that happened when a creature understood for the first time that the space they had been occupying was much closer to something very large and very restrained than they had known. The way you felt when you found out that the thing that had been sitting quietly in the corner of a room you'd been in for years was not a piece of furniture. She didn't look away. Long enough, she said. The young representative looked back down at the documents. Back up. Why didn't you? Because we didn't want to, Yeva said. She said it simply, not as a performance, not with the weight of a prepared line, just the words in the order that made them true. That's the whole thing, that's what nobody believed. We didn't want to. She picked up her folder. We still don't. She closed it. The room didn't make the sound that rooms usually made when a session was winding down, the shifting and gathering and low murmur of people moving toward what came next. It stayed in the quality of the moment before that, the moment where a thing has been said and the air is still holding it. Yeva let it hold. Then she stood up, tucked the folder under her arm, and walked out of the galactic interspecies seat for the last time. The news feeds got the broad shape of it right, which was more than they usually managed. Deo Okonkwo read the scroll on the transit platform at Lagos Station, while he was eating something that smelled vaguely wrong and tasted fine, and had been purchased from a vendor whose name he hadn't caught and couldn't have pronounced if he had. He was in civilian clothes. He had been in civilian clothes for 3 days and was still making the small adjustments that came from spending too long in uniform, standing slightly too straight, turning to check corners out of habit, keeping his kit bag close even though there was nothing in it worth guarding. The scroll ran behind him in the station's display band. Galactic Seat RATIFIES SOLANO ACCORDS. Full Human Capability Disclosure SHOCKS 14 DELEGATIONS. 3 AMBASSADORS HOSPITLIZED. Non-critical. LETHANI Sovereignty Restoration BEGINS immediately. Dominion accepts all TERMS. He read it while he ate. His grandmother had called him 4 times since he landed. He had answered twice. Both times she had asked him 3 questions and he had answered all 3 wrong, and she had made the sound, the specific exhalation, halfway between a sigh and something with less patience in it. That meant she knew and was choosing, for now, not to press. She was going to press eventually. She was going to press when he came through her door with nothing in his hands, because he had left Lagos Station 11 months ago with her prayer beads on his wrist, and he was coming back without them, and she was going to notice before he finished taking off his shoes. He'd given them to a kid. A Lethani child in the resettlement camp on Vashari, not the one from the doorway in Athasev, a different one, a small one who had been sitting by the fence at the edge of the camp's perimeter, and watching the Earth soldiers with the enormous, compound-eyed stillness that Lethani children had when they were trying to understand something. Deo had crouched down to be at the child's level, and the child had looked at the beads on his wrist, and so he had taken them off and held them out, and the child had taken them with both hands, very carefully. The way you took something when you understood it had been someone's for a long time. He had not told his grandmother this. He was going to have to tell his grandmother this. He thought about how to explain it in a way that landed correctly. He could explain that they were a gift, which was true. He could explain that the child had needed something solid to hold, which was also true. He could explain that there were things that passed through hands and kept moving, and that was the right direction for them to go, which was the truest thing, but also the thing his grandmother would find most suspicious coming from him, because it sounded too much like something a person said when they were trying to make a decision sound like wisdom after the fact. He finished his food. The transit platform was full of the ordinary noise of a station that had not stopped running for 19 days of events that had happened very far away. Children arguing with parents, vendors calling out their stock, the specific acoustics of a large enclosed space absorbing the sound of a lot of people moving through it. Lagos Station had an observation deck on the upper level where his grandmother used to stand and watch the ships in the transit corridor, waving at them the way she waved at things, loosely, openly, not signaling anything, just nodding the presence of another moving thing in the world and acknowledging it. He thought about that wave. He thought about a surveillance drone making slow circles over a square in a city that smelled like ozone and something sweet, and a hand going up without deciding to. And what it meant to acknowledge the presence of something watching you when you were standing in the place that watching had been directed toward for 31 years. He didn't have a complete thought about it. He wasn't sure it was the kind of thing that resolved into a complete thought. It was more like something you carried, not heavy, not light, just present. The way certain things were present after they happened. The way the beads had been present on his wrist and were now present somewhere else, in different hands, still being held. The transit announcement came through the platform speakers. His route, his departure time, the familiar cadence of a station that had been calling routes since before he was born and would be calling them after. He picked up his bag. He thought, well, that'll do. Not a great thought. Not a thought that captured the scale of what had happened in 19 days, or 31 years, or 4,000 years of a species holding back something it didn't want to use and being understood for weakness because of it. Not a thought that did justice to 340 ships, or a child in a doorway, or a pair of prayer beads passing from one hand to another in the morning light of a world that smelled wrong and was learning to breathe again. Just a thought. A small, real, sufficient thought. He got on the transit. He went home. Outside, above the station, the sky over Lagos was the exact right color, the specific blue of a planet that was his and had always been his, and would be there when he came back from wherever they sent him next, which they would, because they always did, and he would go because he always did, and the beads would be somewhere else by then, and he would find something else to hold, and it would be enough. It was always enough. That was, in the end, the thing the galaxy had not believed. Not the ships, not the weapons with no treaty names, not the dark capability built in the gaps of language that nobody had thought to close. The thing they had not believed was simpler than all of that. Earth had enough. Had always had enough. Had never needed more. Had held back for 31 years not because it was afraid of losing, but because it understood, at a level deep enough to put in the margin of a file and pass forward and trust the next person to carry, that having the power to take something and choosing not to was the only kind of strength that meant anything.